So, we'll quit the chit chat. Welcome everyone to our webinar, Why Deepfakes Are Scared of Mobile Devices. So, really excited to be here. Like I said, off of vacay, I'm going to try to keep my energy high, but a couple housekeeping items just as we move through. So, not many. We love engagement, ask questions. The webinar will be recorded, but also the Q&A and the comments, everything, it's all in the chat right there. That makes these things so much more enjoyable the more you chime in. We'll have some polls. Hopefully that'll kind of prompt you to jump in. And the shortest of shameless plugs will be for our conferences coming up for a merchant focused audience. It's our first Merchant Fraud Alliance in October in Chicago, and many of you know Fraud Fight Club, which happens in April, and we're at round four, which is wild. But let's get to the lovely folks you're seeing here. My name is PJ Rohul. I'm the co-founder of About Fraud, which hosts Merchant Fraud Alliance and Fraud Fight Club. And we really just want to connect people with resources that help them do their jobs better, fraud fighters, but also relationships, which are really, really important as you build out a Rolodex of phone of friends. But enough from me. I'll pass it over to Laurel for her intro.
I was about to say morning, but I know that it's not morning for all of you. My name is Laurel Sykes. I am the Executive Vice President and Chief Risk Officer for a community bank here on the central coast of California. American Riviera Bank is about 1.5 billion in assets, a little under. We have seven, soon to be eight branches, so we're a little smaller than some of you folks, but we are definitely seeing and a huge uptick in fraud, particularly with the onset of AI and making things more believable than we were able to spot in the past. So I'm excited to see y'all. Been in banking about 35 years now. Um, about 30 of those have been in a risk management role, and in the last decade or so, really dedicated to the fight against fraud. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining. And Brandon, over to you.
Hi, nice to meet you all. Calling in from San Francisco, and I am currently part of the product marketing team here at Persona. Persona doing ID verification, and you might have seen us if you've gone to a few different About Fraud conferences. And most recently, we were out at the Fraud Fight Club event in North Carolina. And what I focus on here at Persona is our suite of identity verification solutions, let's say like government ID verifications, selfie verifications. And as part of that too is also focusing on how we can set up these different verifications to successfully capture and stop fraud.
Perfect. Thank you. So let's use our time wisely and jump in. And so there's some stats here, which we can talk about, but I think just setting the stage from a deepfake perspective, moving beyond the buzz and talking to Laurel, who's in industry, seeing certain things that we read about or talk about. So Laura, I just want to start with you, kind of the impact you're seeing, curious the impact you're seeing of some more sophisticated attacks, specifically, deepfakes.
So I think most of you have probably heard of this case study that we have up here on the screen, but this is that situation where you had a Zoom call going on with a bunch of executives. The CFO allegedly asked for a $25 million wire to go out. It went out because the person who sent it believed that all of the people on the call were truly the executives, when in reality, they were deepfakes. We do see this quite often. We see our CEO being impersonated in different ways to request payments out to people. We see people attempting to make changes to their payroll account information through our HR department. And then on the client side, we're seeing it in a couple of different areas. First of all, a lot of our clients are seeing their vendors being impersonated to circumvent the accounts payable process. And when they when they believe they're working with an actual vendor, they will change that payment information, and they usually don't find out until maybe 60 days later when that vendor calls looking for the money that never came through. A couple of other areas that we're seeing our clients having this happen to them are voice cloning. So we've had, grandparents that thought they were talking to granddaughters. Um, Interesting. I was working a case on a Jamaican card scam last year, and the individuals that were calling, it was a long involved romance scam where our client had been scammed out of so many millions before she got to us, and we were trying to stop it. And I happened to make the comment that I was concerned about the red flags I was seeing because the individuals calling on her behalf, had Jamaican accents. And lo and behold, next time they called, they had used AI to change that. So they sounded like they were right here in the US. So I think we're all seeing it. I think that it's scary how easy it is to impersonate any one of us, because if you look at those of us here today on that webinar, our faces are out there, and it takes, a couple of seconds of listening to my outgoing voicemail message in order to clone my voice. So I think it's something we're all very scared about as we move into this new age, and I'm excited to hear from Brandon about different ways we can protect ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the next thing I'm going to be talking about. But just a personal story. While I was on vacation, a family friend confided in me that he's retired, former CFO type, so helping a nonprofit with finances, but had that kind of feel that he wasn't really doing as much as he could be doing with the nonprofit. And he got that text about, hey, it's a CEO, we need to pay this vendor, and almost responded with urgency out of like guilt that he hadn't been maybe showing up as much. And he's like, "Oh, I this is something I can do." And it just shows you that the intellect doesn't matter. The situations are just so ripe for that. And obviously, if it had been a convincing video or some other type of deep fake, it would have been even more, well, convincing. But just something that came to mind as we talked about CFOs and in whatever respects, and making payments to vendors that are not the right people. But Brandon, over to you. So, what are some high level attributes, I guess, for these sophisticated deepfake attacks?
Yeah. Just looking at the words on the screen, none of these should be new to anybody in the audience because even listening to you, Laurel, listening to you, PJ, like these are things that are continuing to happen, continue to be more prevalent. For example, in the case of like changing the accent of voice cloning over the phone, in the first instance, they were able to obviously have some success because then they went ahead and tried it again, this time using a different accent, an appropriately accented accent. And so these three different topics that we're covering are scale, masking, Gen AI. The first one being scale. Once something works, it makes sense to repeat it. It's similar to scaling a company. These fraudsters work fairly hard on some of these different fraud methods. So it makes sense that they will want to continue to reap the fruits of their labor by continuing to scale that fraud method for higher ROI. And masking here is not just about masking the voice used to impersonate somebody, but also talking about masking where some of these attempts are coming from. Like in the case of impersonating an accent, it's very likely that the person that was calling was not actually from the place that they were trying to be, considering that the voice changed from call one to call two. And that's part of this idea of masking too, is the idea of masking where you're coming from so that you can coordinate, mask all of these different coordinated activities, avoid linking different accounts that are open, different accounts that have had their information stolen and taken over. And we can highlight in this session how using metadata, especially those that are provided through mobile devices, can help with capturing and finding attempts of masking. And then finally, that bit about Gen AI, reconnecting to that previous slide that we were talking about before. Everyone knows about Gen AI. It's been very, very, very prevalent in the media. And what we found is that these won't necessarily be your highest volume of attempts. Some of the highest volume of attempts you might see when it comes to ID verification, when it comes to understanding what the person's identity is at onboarding or switching confirmation. Some of you just might see poorly forged IDs. But from what we started to see, the attempts that are using Gen AI end up being some of the hardest to figure out, some of the hardest to find, hardest to understand. And I bet it gets even harder in 2027. And by 2028, who knows? This webinar you're tuning into then might be an AI person presenting saying, how do we identify humans? AI is just getting that much more advanced year over year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, keep going, Brandon.
No, and I'm just recapping everything. The reason we're bringing everything up, even though none of these are new, scale, masking, usage, and AI, is to just show the different ways and show the different ways that you can beat fraudsters by showing and understanding the different ways that they're continuing to scale their efforts. And we'll cover those in those later slides with the data you may already have access to and the signals that are unlocked by your mobile device.
Yeah. Sometimes I get a little excited. So I was going to jump in and say, I think that this is a lot, right? So like taking just different signals, different approaches that might work in the here and now, and not kind of trying to boil the ocean and saying, how am I going to stop this in 2 years when it's way more, sophisticated and getting into something like masking locations and IPs. So this is something where we're going to launch a poll question. If I can do this right. And just curious, we'll get into how folks mask IPs, how you can kind of get around that. But for those of you that have been able to kind of uncover where things are actually coming from, um, curious which continent were they based in? They were probably disguising to be from one place, from another, but as opposed to another. But um, where are these things originating from? And um, it'll be interesting to see the distributions here. So the way this works is I have to end the poll to show the results. So if you guys can just go with your go with your instinct, and then I'll end the poll shortly. We have a few leaders in the clubhouse, not shocking in the least. So end the poll here, share the results. So probably many of you are very familiar with scam, deepfake, other types of fraud out of Africa and Southeast Asia. I'm not saying those are the exact areas of Asia, but North America as well, and then Australia is just behaving well, I guess. But any thoughts from the panel about what you're seeing here?
Yeah, if I could, I think that echoes a lot of what we see too. We have a decent amount of people that are based out of North America. And out of those companies that are based out of North America, we also have a decent amount of the new user signups who are purported to be coming out of California, or not California, out of the United States of America too, using different driver's license seen across the state. But what we found is that with a fair amount of these fraud rings, many of them are actually originating from out of North America, and purposely targeting some of these higher yield companies that are based in North America that have established these sorts of like valuable services that present like a pretty valuable target to try to fraud.
Yeah.
Yeah, same here. Obviously, the scam compounds happening in Asia, but I think in terms of the deep fakes and the identity verification and all of that, we're actually seeing our most recent cases are here in the United States, and it's business identity theft. So again, they're looking for those higher target clients, and I think that the scammers are realizing in the last year or so that businesses have a lot more access to funds than consumers. So it gets really hard because I think banks often spend a lot of time verifying the company, but not necessarily the individuals that are going to be doing the transactions. And I think it's a weak spot for us that we really need to focus on.
Yeah. Yeah, no, agree. And I think then it gets more interesting on how they're doing this, Brandon, masking IPs, and then even more interesting on what you can do to defend against that. So I think you have some examples here of how it's being done, Brandon.
Yeah, and these are a couple examples for pretty significant cases, significant in slightly different ways. So right now, I think we're sort of a step one when it comes to any sort of regulations around the use of like IP masking technology. And I'm not saying the only reason to use a VPN is entirely to mask your location specifically so you can go and like fraud your nearest newest bank. But I am saying that the use of masking geolocation to avoid linking those accounts is something that's known. And we can see two cases on the left-hand side here, where the first one is within the bogus claims field. And this is exactly what Laurel was talking about, is impersonating a legitimate business, or at least seemingly legitimate business, and understanding what sorts of funds may be available to those businesses. In this case, scamming Medicare to claim that you never received, erroneously never received medical equipment, so you can continue to be insured by that. And in the next case here, Operation Lightning Below, what ended up happening was that there were some routers used in order to sell masking services to additional fraudsters, and multiple countries were involved in taking down all these different routers that were being used to make it seem as if location was being hopped from country to country to country. And it's obviously a very significant deal with all of these different countries working together across multiple continents to make sure that fraudsters didn't have this system that they could go through in order to actually go and figure out or go and mask any sort of activity by transferring it through all these different routers. And that's really what these two situations have in common, is not just the scale of what they were trying to do, but also the fact that they were using like fairly clever ways, fairly sophisticated ways, even beyond the use of VPNs to actually go and mask their location.
Yeah, no, and Calderon, hopefully I pronounced that right. I'm going to get to your question, but it may be answered here because we're getting into then Brandon and Laurel. Like what signals, what accessible signals that many folks have that can help with this, right? Geolocation, velocity signals. So, Brandon, I'd love for you to dive into this, and then I'll follow up with Laurel on kind of how she sees this in the real world and the value of things like this.
Yeah, definitely. And I know we talk the entire session topic is supposed to be why deepfakes are scared of mobile devices. But I figured we'll try to make it more accessible to everyone, whether they're doing any sort of identity verification, let's say during onboarding through a desktop device or a mobile device. And so we'll start off with different signals, different contexts that can be collected even through desktop, whether you're using a desktop-based implementation or a mobile app, because these are definitely great starter points. And the first thing is the use of IP. We can use IP to find specific countries or general locations just because of IP's formatting. Um, Thankfully, they had the foresight to go and set up IP according to different regions. But one step further might be to do calculations off of IP to understand what makes logical sense. And when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about these three bullet points you see underneath the example of geolocation-based calculations, with one of the most prominent being this concept of impossible travel. If at the very beginning of the session we see that somebody is, let's say, in the United States, and then 5 minutes later we see that their IP we can see that the location of the user based on their IP has jumped to somewhere like, let's say, China, then that's probably some indication that something is happening. That something doesn't necessarily mean it's fraud in and of itself. But what we're trying to do here is we're trying to talk through all the different signals that you can potentially pull, all those different contextual points that you can potentially pull to understand whether there's a chance of suspicious behavior happening. And in this case, the chance of suspicious behavior we're trying to understand is whether there's a chance that they're masking their IP or masking their location. And then another step to understand whether there's some activity that appears to be suspicious is mapping those different IPs to popular VPNs. Popular VPNs have reserved sets of IPs, different blocks, different VPNs like Nord, for example. And understanding whether they're using a VPN might be that additional step to understanding if there is potential for suspicious activity to happen. And then the final point that we're making here, the final bolded section for velocity count. When we're talking about velocity count, we're trying to understand the number of devices or number of sessions that might be associated with an IP with one network And this is really why they're masking, because we're trying to get back to that question of scale. We're trying to get back to that question of understanding how many different attempts, how many different accounts might be originated from one place. And that goes back to that very first slide that we saw about the, let's say, like 8 stolen IDs used to open like 60 accounts or something like that. All of these different things were connected at one point. And if they're all originating from that same network, then we're already seeing signs of scale, already seeing signs that they're signs of scale that the fraudsters would be attempting to mask. And of course, IP and inferring geolocation is great because it's widely available. And like we mentioned before, the goal is to reduce the ROI. The goal is to make it harder for them to force them into remembering to mask their location every single time. If we were to be able to track any sort of scaled coordinated attempts by tracking IP. And that's only fair because they're also adding complication to your everyday life.
Yeah. Yeah. And Calderon, I'm gonna get to your question, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, Laurel, on these types of signals in the wild.
Well, so unfortunately, a bank like us, we don't get to see this sort of thing in the wild before it happens. We typically are looking at this information after fraud has been reported. And I think the place that we're seeing it most often is exactly what Brandon is saying is what we're seeing. We will be working a bank impersonation case. And there's been a couple that have hit our region. I saw a little shout out to Pismo Beach. So love that. Love to see that there's others here on the Central Coast. But the Central Coast was being hit hard with these bank impersonation scams. And unfortunately, clients were giving up their the username, password, and the one-time password in order to initiate transactions. So we would find out after the fact, and we would see a pattern in the same IP address being used for some of these scams. And then we have channels through the back end where we can report those types of things through FSI SAC or whomever it is. And as soon as we identified the IP address, we watched it change to a new one the next time they logged in. So they obviously are. It's like whack-a-mole, right? You try to catch the one thing, but we do oftentimes see things like different time zones. Being here in California, we'll see somebody logging in at what would have been, 2 in the morning or 3 in the morning, which would might have been out of pattern for clients. And it would be great to be able to see this real time so that we're not reacting to it after the fraud's already been reported.
Yeah, I think that's it, is as upstream as you can. And not that these are simple pieces of technology or data, but they are generally accessible to many folks, whether using a vendor or other data you already have with, the velocity of the IP or session or other things like that. So Calderon's question was, is it possible now to see the original IP address even when they are behind a VPN?
Yeah, I can take that question. It's not necessarily possible to see the original IP address without having knowledge that this is passing through a VPN, just by nature of how the VPNs are working to redirect traffic. Because what we're doing is we're collecting the origination request of that thing. Is the exported field possible behind a VPN? So short answer is not strictly with how the VPNs work. And that's the entire nature of the VPNs is they're designed to mask the activity so that it's not trackable back through that particular server. Maybe unless it's like a free VPN. And what they're doing is actually collecting data so they can pass it back to other people. But I think like that little minor point aside, what we will talk about in I think like a couple slides is how to actually infer the location, even when a user is using VPN, specifically through a mobile application. So I won't give it away quite here yet, but sorry, we'll answer the question in a couple short minutes.
Yeah. And to that point, as we kind of fly forward, looking at link analysis, and I think precise GPS is after this.
Mhm.
Um, but mobile signals can be more rich and insightful as to what behavior is going on here. So maybe Brandon, you can unpack the value of a link analysis,
Mhm.
and I can flip over to the next slide whenever you're ready.
Yeah, and, this is really speaking to Laurel's point earlier, where Sometimes we don't have all the information available at the very first time a fraudster goes through the onboarding flow to stop them because we've never experienced them before. We've never experienced that fraud when we've never experienced that patterns. Maybe we're a brand new bank, we've never experienced fraud altogether. And link analysis is what helps you identify the scale, confirm their pattern, and then set up future fraud rules based off your learnings so that as you're continuously refining the onboarding process, continuing to refine those fraud rules, you're able to understand how to block specific vectors, specific types of patterns that are coming up. And when I'm talking about link analysis here, there's this little example on the right-hand side. Your version of link analysis may or may not look entirely like this, but it's most impactful when you're able to actually visually see those potential matches between coordinated fraud attempts. And there's a lot of ways that you can approach setting this up. The first being to the first being that identifying the shared attributes. And this could be as simple as understanding like the shared IP if they forgot to mask it a handful of times. Or it could be even simpler and it could just go down to identifying whose name was used to sign up for all those different accounts. Like we mentioned in that first example slide, it was those 60 accounts were set up with only 8 different IDs. So on average, each of those IDs were used about like 7 times or so to spawn all those different accounts. And so you're actually able to just tie together all of these fraudulent accounts using that one user. And more advanced attribute that we also mentioned here is the ability, sorry, going back one slide, is just using something like an image. For example, if there's any sort of contextual image from like a selfie that was taken for remote identity, remote onboarding to verify that they are the person who actually holds the ID, you may be able to actually connect those as well. And the final point I want to mention here with this retroactive looking link analysis to form your future fraud rules is building in the ability to explore multiple degrees of connection away. Like if person A and person B have the same IP, and person B and person C have that shared name on their account, you start to build this concept. You start to build more higher and higher confidence that actually all those different people are related. And if you're able to examine all different attributes from that entire onboarding session across all those different 20 or so people, then you start to really rule out the chance that this is all just coincidence. And then you could actually create very, very high confidence fraud rules as a result of that. And then
Yeah.
getting back to, yeah, sorry. I want to get to the precise GPS question that we've been skirting around for so long. Please go,
Yeah, yeah.
BJ.
Well, you weren't scared around it. I was just getting overexcited again. So let's jump to that. We can get some Laurel thoughts and any other questions you guys have. Please fire them in there.
Yeah, and here's where, sorry, do you want to do Laurel thoughts first before we get into this?
Why don't you talk about the precise GPS and then we'll have Laurel just unpack whatever she thinks is interesting.
Sounds good. And this is the first of where we're starting to get into the mobile specific insights. I think it's no surprise to anybody that's used Google or Apple Maps that our phones have GPS. That's how we navigate. It's how we get around. It's how we're able to still access services. Even with the newest, as an aside, like the newest Apple Watch can make calls even when you're in remote areas, which is really fascinating to me too. GPS coordinates aren't easy to be spoofed at all, and definitely not easy to be spoofed using the same methods that fraudsters already know of for IP. Like you can't necessarily use NordVPN to spoof your precise GPS coming out of your phone. It doesn't mean that we necessarily need to track these coordinates from every single person every single time. Because tracking this is sensitive personal information. You don't want to hold this every single time. You don't want to take on that additional risk, but you may want to do this for elevated fraud risk cases where you have a suspicion that they have been already been obfuscating IP as a means of obfuscating their location to mask that scale, the coordination of those attempts. And using precise GPS is a way to cut through all those known ways of masking IP in order to figure out whether all these 60 different accounts were created actually from the same place.
Awesome. Laurel, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think my thoughts are going to be a little specific to California, but obviously the concern being the privacy implications. Here in California, tracking precise geolocation causes all kinds of opt-in, opt-out information. So it's always interesting that conflict between preventing fraud and privacy rights. And, to me, why do we have to protect the privacy of a scammer? But I guess, in doing so, you could potentially be needing to address that. And I think in any sort of fraud situation, I think one of the most important takeaways is to make sure you're involving all the right people to evaluate any kind of technology that you may be using to make sure you're thinking everything through.
Yeah, no, it's a great point on state specific, privacy laws, and that balance is always going to be there. But if you have access to this data, these signals, again, it could be a vendor, it could be other things. This isn't just for IDV and deep fakes. These are useful techniques across the board for other use cases, and they may be more easily accessible, or easier to implement. We're going to get into things when you look at alternative ways to verify IDs and things that are very Gen AI specific. But these things I think might help you with some low-hanging fruit, Brandon and Laurel. But before we get into alternative ways of stopping fraud, I'm going to do another poll about NFC verification. So, pretty simple question. Do you offer NFC verification as a way to capture IDs today? And this will lead into a deeper conversation on that. So, um, take a moment, yes or no. Don't overthink it, and we'll end the poll in a matter of seconds, we'll say. All right. Again, probably can't see what I'm seeing, but I want to get the participation closer to 50% if I could. Um, um, and if you're not familiar with NFC verification, maybe that could have been a third option. Not sure. Um, but let's call it complete there, share the result. So, um, 70% in the no category, but almost a third of you using it. So, the panel, as we look forward, is this what you're seeing, whether from working at a bank or working at a solution provider?
Yeah, I think the answer to this kind of tricky question probably honestly depends on where you're dialing in from. And then what types of IDs are you used to accepting? Like if we are in California, I know for sure that the previous iteration of driver's licenses definitely didn't have any sort of chips that you could use to scan with any sort of NFC. So it definitely makes sense depending on what type of customer base you have.
Yeah, yeah, makes sense. Um,
Another thing, just off the top. Oh, great. There's a little beeping going on downstairs. Hopefully that's not bothering everybody. But another thing to
okay.
think about is the ability to identify a client when they are calling in, and maybe being able to use some sort of chip technology, because as we're finding, passcodes don't work anymore because clients are giving them out or they don't remember them. It's getting harder and harder to identify when they're calling based on account level data. It's we've always used the something you have and something to identify clients, and that's becoming harder and harder to do. So I think that chip technology would be fantastic in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And so we'll get into that, I think, in a few slides, Brandon. But I guess just taking a step back, what are some common ways folks verify IDs today?
Yeah, and I know everyone's doing this already, but we want to start everything with something that's accessible, something that you can already do. So whether it's manual or automated review, the first bullet point, the validity and formatting checks are a pretty commonplace set of criteria to go through, whether an ID is expired, whether the color looks off, whether it looks like the photo is in the middle of the ID when it should be on the left or something like that. And I might be underselling a little bit with 70% of you saying that you do NFC verification. I would bet that you all have global user bases. So that only exacerbates the problem of like understanding how many different IDs there are per country, especially if it's a country like the US with all the different states having their own IDs and different formats and different years to track. But we want to make sure we're covering the accessible baseline. And that means not just validating the ID itself as the starting point, but also making sure that the person on the ID and the information on the ID are real, which leads to these next 2 points of the selfie, the portrait matching, making sure that the ID picture belongs to the account owner by at least comparing the visuals of the portrait to the person submitting it, and then also making sure that you're running it against an authoritative, trusted database to confirm that it's not something like a synthetic ID.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if I could
Go ahead,
just
Laura.
add a
Yeah.
couple of I, PJ, I apologize if you're already going here, but a couple of limitations that probably a lot of you have with your current ID verification process. I mean, first of all, you talk about all the different licenses in the United States. We still have those books that you use to compare the driver's license against the picture to make sure you know what they're supposed to look like in different states. Um, that's not the only thing that we do, but I'm a little bit joking. But the other thing that's challenging is a lot of times when you're evaluating the identity information against PII, against sources that exist out there, you're verifying things like the issuance date of the social security number or the fact that they've reported a different address. And oftentimes, if that individual is somewhere in the ballpark of being correct, it's not going to raise a red flag. And also, you're totally reliant on your frontline individuals that are looking at the identification information to make a judgment call rather than giving them real tools that they can use to potentially determine when fraud is happening. And then more and more clients aren't coming into the branches to open their accounts. So then in order to verify their ID, how are you able to carry that forward?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And uh, quick question about what NFC stands for. Um, Either you guys want to field
Oh
that?
yeah. No, you're exactly right. I think it was Nina. The it does stand for near field communication. Same thing that you're using to tap your phone to pay at any sort of kiosk, grocery stores.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and as PJ mentioned, there's lots of uses for it. Those of you with marketing teams at your institutions might have people that are really excited about tracking it so that they can provide offers to people as they walk by the stores with their telephone
Mm.
and say, "Hey, you can go here for 10% off." So um, those are the types of things. Again, you gotta have that balance between protecting someone's privacy and using it. But I think that's an
Yeah.
example of how it would be used out in the wild.
Yeah. Nina, I think you understood it correctly then when you responded to the survey. And then as we go past common methods, and again, some of these things can be helpful, but then there's weaknesses, there's gaps, right? So Brandon, maybe you can explain some of those, and we'll dive a little bit deeper into the NFC component.
Yeah, and what we're showing here are examples that are very, very common, and actually relate back to what Laurel mentioned before, which was those impersonation attempts. Being able to successfully phish somebody in order to get their personal details makes it that much harder to confirm authenticity of this individual, even with all those different layers of checks that we mentioned before. Which is why we actually end up talking about NFC on this next slide. Please, Jay, please.
Hmm.
Considering how to accept the ID itself. Most remote onboarding, as Laura called out, is using camera capture today. But we're actually starting to see standards in the EU change. And those of you that do accept IDs through NFC probably have some sort of EU customer base because this change actually started a while ago. When all new passports in the EU were mandated to have that ICAO compliant chip, started to turn into e-passports, biometric passports. And then there's actually another change happening this year, starting next month, that extends to national IDs, where national IDs are now also required to have that chip that can verify the user information as an alternative means to capturing personal information compared to using a camera. And because of that shift to where all these different forms of ID are starting to have that chip, and in response to a heightened level of fraud, some of the latest remote identity proofing standards there now reference use of NFC to capture ID for higher assurance use cases, in use cases where there might be higher risk of fraud or revenue loss to fraud, using NFC as a means of capturing that personal information, specifically for remote onboarding. And like we mentioned before, this is when we're talking about NFC, near field communication, we're talking about the same sort of tech that your phone already has that you've probably used in an outbound manner to send your, let's say, like credit card information to the kiosk so you can successfully complete that purchase. It's the same sort of technology where that allows you to collect data by tapping the ID to the phone rather than using the phone's camera to capture the information. And even though we've been so EU-centric talking about this is the same thing in the US. Your passport likely already has that little chip, and you may have used it at certain airports globally too. But those little chips being much, much harder to spoof than traditional physical ID personal information, where you might be able to alter the text just by nature of how that chip information is able to be cryptographically verified.
And Brandon, you're talking about this in terms of onboarding new clients. And PJ, I don't remember which bank it is, but I know at Fraud Fight Club earlier this year, there was a presentation with a bank that is investigating using chip technology that exists in their debit cards for some similar reasons. Tap the phone to be able to identify somebody when they're calling in over the phone
Mm.
later on after they're already onboarded, but maybe trying to do something nefarious once they already have the account open. So exciting stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And just again, more enhanced kind of verification methods as opposed to what we talked about, the ways to verify government IDs earlier on. Um, and before we get to one more poll, Brandon, you want to talk about the silent network authentication?
Yeah, absolutely. And because it's all about phones, capturing things through mobile, capturing different contextual signals through mobile applications. Part of that is also understanding an alternative to an ID capture. How can you use the phone's SIM to validate integrity? I'm not talking about one-time passcodes because one-time passcodes are known. They can be received by virtual cards that aren't actually aligned with any sort of real physical mobile device. And they can definitely be intercepted as well. So silent network authentication is another means of identifying the integrity of the device, the existence of that SIM directly against the mobile carriers who have that information. And it can also, as a byproduct, provide a smoother user experience because the user doesn't need to go back and enter in something like a passcode. So just exploring this is just alternative ways of stopping ID fraud by exploring some of these emerging technologies that are already adopted and used in some different contexts out there with both NFC and silent network authentication.
So, yeah, yeah, like you said, the core of this is, mobile and signals and defeating sophisticated attacks like deepfakes. So this is particularly relevant. Another question from Nina was, do any U.S. driver's licenses, are they equipped with NFC chips? Um, which I don't think so, but it could.
I don't think so either. I think if we are continuing to see the pattern of slow rollout across, let's say, like the federal level with our biometric passports today, and then seeing if states continue to adopt it, especially as like remote identity proof becomes more common. I can see a world where, let's say, like 5 to 10 years from now, some states start exploring it. But I think just the nature of like how our states move, it'll just take a little while to have it spread throughout the states.
Yeah. And then how valuable can it be if it's not in any state driver's license, which is what we all generally use as opposed to a passport. But still interesting to have in the back of your mind as options become more realistic. So we're gonna do launching a poll, and then we'll be wrapping up very soon. So this one, as you can see from here, is about finding signs of Gen AI and have you experienced the suspected use of Gen AI in fraudulent IDs and or new user onboarding? Um, we'll wait a little bit longer, see how many participants we can get as you get the last 15 minutes, man. It's tougher to get people juiced up to answer a poll,
Mhm.
but we're actually seeing a mix of answers here. So we'll give it a couple more seconds, at least get a third of the folks participating. And Yeah, getting closer to 50%. So yeah, 40%. Um, so even with 40%, you got two-thirds roughly saying yes, and actually a third saying no, which there's so much talk about Gen AI and how much you're seeing in the IDs and not that you feel like everyone's seeing it, right? But that's, I think, interesting that there's still over a third that haven't seen or haven't experienced it yet. So, any comments from the panel on these results?
I mean, I think it boils down to your delivery channels. Are you a bank that is pretty much brick and mortar? Are you an online institution where you have to rely on identity verification to validate IDs? And in those cases, you are seeing Gen AI to falsify the data in order to bypass your controls and get those accounts opened online. But I think we still see a lot of the old school the case we worked last year was a business identity theft case, and the individual came into multiple of our branches, each time with a driver's license from a different state, each time with a different name. So a little different than we're talking about here, where you've got someone that's trying to pretend to be somebody that truly does exist, and using Gen AI to do that. But you also think about those security questions, or the LexisNexis. I don't know how, but somehow I always get asked about my ex stepmother, and what age she or what year she was born, through those questions. But that's another place where scammers can really get through our channels, and it's more and more important to have all the protection in all the different areas.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and my answer to that's actually also on this next slide. We are maybe not seeing, it's not like oh, sorry, PJ, can we go to the next slide, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me stop sharing, get out of this guy, and there you go.
So these are some fun examples that are just meant to highlight how easy it is to use Gen AI. But we don't necessarily see Gen AI overwhelmingly now. It's not even the most common way to fraud driver's licenses and selfie videos. But the idea is models are not only getting better, and I think someone saw like maybe you don't know what you don't know, because the models are not only getting better, they're getting lighter. Like a few years ago, I started exploring some of these image generation models to generate images for marking collateral, but actually ended up giving up and going back to Figma because every small tweak could take up to 10 minutes to run. And those early images needed quite a lot of small tweaks. But fast forwarding to today, even my personal MacBook Air can run image generation locally in half the time, but with 10x the detail.
Mm. Um, yeah, it again, it varies. I thought the comment by Troy about you don't know what you don't know, you don't think you've seen it, but you have because but you didn't recognize it. Um, and interesting what you guys have been seeing, Brandon. There's a question from Sai. I think it's just more about the NFC. Wonder how downstream NFC authentication could help. Guessing that would have limited success to counter fraud apps. Any thoughts on that? We only have so much time, but if you guys, um, yeah, and
I mean, the only way I've heard about it being used to counter fraud was that other bank, and I'm not from the bank, so I can't speak to it, but I do know that they were working on utilizing the chip technology and NFC from the debit card in order to, verify that they're talking to someone over the telephone. So you're right. I don't know about in other apps. Brandon, I don't know if you have anything to add on that.
Yeah, and I think one example of that is similar to how you might insert your card into the machine to like keep the chip inserted. It can work functionally the same as on the phone. So you're keeping that chip in there to ensure that you have possession of the card. The only difference here is if you're making something like an account settings change, there's this feature where this bank might ask you to, if you're using the mobile app, tap the debit card against your phone to again verify existence of that same chip.
yeah. Yeah, cool. I want to get to these last few,
Mhm.
especially with the injection attacks, because I think mobile
Yes.
mobile is. is has as many good signals, as many good approaches as we've outlined here, but injection attacks can be particularly tricky. So, Brandon, if you want to walk through this, and then we'll quickly get to the injection attacks, and we'll kind of wrap up.
Yeah, I think if you all want to take a screenshot of this government ID and selfie, it's a basic list of how-tos based on details unique to each. Details that GenAI still has a little bit of trouble with today and probably will have a little bit of trouble with in the next year or so. But the point that I want to get to with this was this context column on the way right side. Mobile manufacturers like Apple and Samsung have actually steadily been improving security devices, which actually gives us a lot of detail that we can draw from. And that sort of detail is what helps us. Sorry, next slide, please.
Yep.
That level of detail helps us understand whether there's signs of an injection attack. And in this case, what I'm referring to is video injection attacks. And the reason we're talking about that is because Gen AI's limitation, at least as far as this context today, is while it can generate that sort of evidence for the government ID or generate that sort of evidence for even like a corroborated selfie video, like you can see here, you still have to hijack the camera feed in order to feed your image in, at least in a way that looks natural, that doesn't look like you have your phone or your tablet held up to your screen. And understanding that is key to understanding what to look out for, especially if you're able to collect additional information from mobile application.
Awesome.
Anything here, PJ, before we go into mobile application benefits?
There you go. Do you want me to stay here in this slide?
Yes, please. And for simplicity's sake, I actually merged this concept of application with application and device because you'll probably want to start, if we're going through this checklist, of understanding whether it's a mobile device to begin with, an actual mobile device as compared to a piece of software running on a computer, like we're starting to see a little bit more often. And on the device level, you can examine metadata for signs that a device might be emulated. For example, by comparing like a camera to hardware mismatch, understanding if it says like MacBook Pro camera to a purported like iPhone 16. Um, but earlier, I also mentioned that Apple and Samsung have given us tools, and two of them are actually highlighted here on the right-hand side. Understanding whether there is a complete digital signature from Apple App Station or Google Play Integrity. Those confirm whether an app bundle is the original and or whether there's any chance of manipulation. And that sign of manipulation is again what we're looking for when it comes to those video injection attacks to understand whether the camera feed is potentially being hijacked if something else has actually changed the app codecs or something else. And runtime on the next slide helps us dig a little bit more into the root issue and understand if there's anything within the environment, within the operating environment, within the code to see if there's any signs of manipulation. With different fraudsters using tools like Frida or Magis, which are some of the logos on the left, to do something like device or app tampering so that you can understand. And what you're doing is you're evaluating different libraries that are spun up, the Lorenzo scripts, or any other indicators that might show you whether a video file is actually being fed into the stream, like an MP4 file with the GenAI image, rather than the device's actual native camera feed. And then finally, as we continue to progress from device app runtime to the actual data being sent, we're now looking at the chance of evaluating whether there's a man in the middle attack. And then what we're looking for here is understanding whether there's any particular redirects or different origins of requests to the remote identity verification flow. And mobile devices are uniquely set up to relay all this information we mentioned from the device application to the runtime environment to this network level. And while it won't necessarily tell you exactly whether something is Gen AI or not, they give you additional context to evaluate. And that's really just wrapping up everything we mentioned here is building all the different contexts you have and combining all that different context so that you can have the most information to give you the highest confidence that you're actually successfully stopping any sort of deepfakes with all the different contexts you're able to glean from these mobile applications.
Very good. And I think, yeah, the old thank you slide, 4 minutes left. So, uh, hopefully you guys saw the progression there. I mean, the idea is to talk about different signals. And yes, Gen AI and deepfakes are the most sophisticated. But when you look at things like velocity and geolocation and trying to, unmask IPs and NFC, where that can play a role, NFC verification, forgot the second word there, and all the way up into the most recent things, Brandon and Laurel. discussed. There's a lot of options, and not all of them are going to be for the most sophisticated Gen AI and or deepfake attacks, but some can be used for that. And every bank, FI, is going to have access to different signals, different budgets, different roadmaps as to where they can get to these things. So it was interesting to hear from you, Laurel, and kind of how proactive you can be versus potentially others. But we wanted to kind of hopefully at least lay out a menu of options and talk very realistically about what they can be used for right now, at least. And, it's been mentioned a couple of times. It's going to change. It's going to change in the next 6 months, next month, next 6 years, obviously. Um, but I think it's time to say thank you. I think I got to all the questions. Thank you, Brandon and Laurel. I just kind of move things around air traffic control, and you guys did an awesome job providing some good insights. And thanks for everyone who engaged in the chat.